Hi guys, let's talk Savvy B. So I've got a Sauv Blanc from the appellation of Pouilly-Fumé in Loire Valley, and it's by Domaine du Bouchot. And although this is a 2021, it's actually made from vines planted in 1955. So when we think about Savvy B, we're either thinking about Loire Valley in France or New Zealand. We're typically thinking of the flavor profile of passion fruit. That generally is a sign that it's been slightly warmer, so having that tropical note. And when we have sort of slightly cooler period, we tend to have flavor profiles like green apple. New Zealand, we really associate Sauv Blanc with. They make fantastic Sauv Blancs, but actually Loire Valley is also really well known for Sauv Blanc, particularly two different appellations within Loire Valley, Pouilly-Fumé, and I think it's actually Pouilly-Fumé, but my pronunciation is not great. And the other place is Sancerre. I think that's how you pronounce it. And yeah, so both known for being very limestone-based soil. So we get that nice sort of minerality that comes through. When we talk about Fumé, we're talking about a little bit of smokiness that tends to come through. So the flavor profile can be sort of more green apple, very crisp citrus. There is sometimes that tropical note, a little bit of passion fruit, but it's really known as well for that mineral drive, the limestone that comes through. And when we're talking about the difference between Sancerre versus Pouilly-Fumé, so this one is that little bit of smokiness. So Fumé, think smoky, and the type of wine or the style of wine that you will get will also depend on the producer, the style that they want to make, and I'll talk you through that in a second, and also the temperature of the vintage. Going back to the first point, so the producer. So the producer sometimes will focus on a really sort of fruit-forward style. So they will generally make the wine in stainless steel vats. It's what we call a reductive style of winemaking. So we try not to interact with oxygen like we would when we're making wine or aging it in oak, where we naturally have that oxygen that comes through the oak and interacts with the wine and changes the flavor profile. So when we make a wine in a stainless steel tank, we normally think of it as a reductive style. So we're kind of limiting that interaction with oxygen so that we can retain the varietal characteristics, so that fruit flavor profile of the wine without sort of adding the complexity that you would get from the oxygen interaction. Other producers will actually age in oak and ferment in oak, and they will also age on lees. So when we're fermenting the alcohol, so sugar and yeast to make alcohol, that yeast through that process dies and it becomes what we call lees. And you have gross lees, which is like heavy sediment that sinks to the bottom, and you have fine lees, which are like little particles that float around the wine and actually integrate some of their flavor into the wine. So it gives it that nice sort of toasty, biscuity flavor that you typically will get with, say, like a Chardonnay. So some producers will actually age in oak to get that additional complexity with the interaction of oxygen, and also age on lees so that we have that sort of, it's called yeast autolysis, that sort of biscuity, toasty flavors from the dead yeast that are integrating themselves into the wine. So that's the process called yeast autolysis. If the vintage, so the second point that I had mentioned was the temperature of the vintage. If the vintage, so the temperature of the, when I say temperature of the vintage, what I mean is when we go through that grape ripening process, if the temperature is particularly cold, we're lengthening that ripening process, which means acid levels in the grape drop more slowly, sugar levels rise more slowly. So if it's a particularly cool vintage, we're going to struggle to ripen that grape, but also we're generally going to have very high acid. So sometimes to sort of bring that acid level down and soften it a little bit, winemakers will actually take the wine through a process called malolactic fermentation. And it's a really common process that separates a very crisp Chardonnay from a Chardonnay that's got beautiful sort of roundness, creaminess, buttery notes. So malolactic fermentation, you very much see the difference with Chardonnay, that winemaking choice and that style that it produces. So If the vintage is cooler and we need to soften, or the winemaker needs to soften that acidity, they will generally take the wine through that process of malolactic fermentation. It's not a typical fermentation like when we're converting sugar and yeast to make alcohol. It's more of a conversion. So sometimes malolactic fermentation is called malolactic conversion or MLF. And basically what it means is grapes have naturally tartaric acid, and that is acid that we generally find in apples. So think of like tart acid. And what it is basically lactic acid bacteria that breaks down that tart sort of acid, the malic acid. Sorry, I don't know why I said tartaric. Malic acid in the grape. Tartaric is another type of acid that's in the grape, which at cool temperatures in your wine, like if you ever left a white wine in the fridge and you see like a little bit of like crystallization or sediment in the bottom, that's actually tartaric acid or tartaric crystals, also known as wine diamonds. I'm completely digressing, but coming back to the malolactic fermentation, what I meant to say is we have malic acid, which is naturally occurring in the grape, and lactic acid bacteria. So the malic acid is also in apples, and that lactic acid bacteria actually breaks down the malic acid and turns it or converts it into lactic acid, which is what we find in milk. Always think of MLF, so malolactic fermentation, as lactic acid, essentially. So we're bringing in those sort of creamy, buttery notes. So think of it as like dairy. That is the sort of connection point to remember it. So that is what brings in those sort of like buttery notes, that sort of creaminess, that full-bodied sort of mouthfeel that you'll get. And it's really evident when you try two Chardonnays side by side, one that's gone through malolactic fermentation and one that hasn't. It's the best way to understand the difference in the flavour profile. And so coming back to Sauv Blanc, if you've had an oaked Sauv Blanc or one that's gone through lees aging or one that's gone through malolactic fermentation, it still has those varietal characteristics that are Sauvignon Blanc, but it feels more like you're drinking a Chardonnay, but it's not quite a Chardonnay. I don't know if you've ever had sort of an oaked or mellowed Sauv Blanc, but that's probably the best way to describe it. It kind of feels like you're drinking a Chardonnay, but it's not quite a Chardonnay, if that makes sense. Yeah, if the vintage is particularly cold, a producer will generally bring on or encourage malolactic fermentation, which basically means that as well, after we go through that alcoholic fermentation, they raise the temperature slightly, and that's what encourages that lactic acid bacteria, which then breaks down the malic acid and converts it into lactic acid, so that softens the acidity, brings on some more of those buttery notes, that creamy sort of full mouth feel. That's basically the difference. So this one I am going to try under Coravin. So this is a really great producer. You'll probably notice that I'm always using a blunt knife, taking off the capsule. This wine, this producer, Domaine du Bouchot, however you pronounce that. So he is actually a pioneer in the area Pouilly-Fumé and Loire Valley. So he is a pioneer for producing biodynamic wines, and also was the first certified organic producer in the region. So certified organic essentially means that we're limiting the use of pesticides, and so we are at a level where it can be certified organic. But biodynamic is a step further. Biodynamic is not just about limiting the amount of pesticides and looking at sustainable approaches. It's actually looking at the broader environment. So not just the terroir, but all of the different things that actually influence that terroir. So instead of, if there's a pest in the vineyard, for example, instead of using a pesticide and using it in small doses or when it's going to have the most amount of effect, they will actually look at the ecosystem as a whole and introduce, say, a predator to that pest or something that sort of naturally balances that ecosystem. And biodynamic production or vineyard management is also about looking at almost like the horoscope of wine. It's kind of like looking at a whole holistic approach of what is the climate like? What is the moon cycles like? If we think about, for example, the gamma rays that come from the sun, we didn't actually realize the influence of that for many, many years. And obviously those rays do affect the ripening of the grapes. So it's also looking at sort of when are they, having the most influence on the wine. And also soil. We are starting to know a lot more about soil and kind of like how we have our own sort of gut microbiome. It's also looking about the sort of microbiome of the different soil types and different things that influence that and how that then translates into the wine. Because obviously when we have a vine, it's pulling up the resources and pushing those into the grape. And that develops the flavor profile, not just of the grape itself, but of the entire environment. And that's why, when we have like limestone soil, we can generally taste that in the wine because we're pulling up those resources and it's building out the entire flavor profile, not just the grape, but the entire environment and the minerals that go into producing that grape. So I'm digressing a little bit, but that's essentially what biodynamic production is. And it's said to have a greater reflection of terroir for all of those sorts of reasons, is that we're essentially creating and influencing the natural ecosystem as naturally as possible to create that wine. And there's also some critics as well now that are starting to taste wine at different sort of cycles or moon cycles when they say that the wine is at its best, or based on, I think it's different moon cycles of when the best time to pick grapes are, because sometimes in a warmer climate, for example, if you pick them at night, you can retain more of the acid in the grapes. They don't drop as quickly, similar to that longer ripening period. So I'm not an expert on biodynamic, but they're just some of the things that I've been learning a little bit about it. I went to a really interesting masterclass that sort of talked through these sort of components. It was by Trackless Vineyards and I think it was New South Wales Wine, I want to say. But yeah, it was also hosted by the Sydney Wine Academy, which is where I did my WESET course through. So really, really interesting masterclass, and being able to be spoken through by an expert in the space, those different things to influence the grape, and then being able to taste wines side by side that have that sort of biodynamic approach. So it's really, really interesting. So this is a pioneer in the region for biodynamic production and the first certified organic producer in the region. So let's taste the wine. I always find this the fun part. So it's got a nice colour to it. Generally, if it's aged in oak, for example, or on lees, it will have a deeper colour. So really nice colour. So crisp. You can definitely smell the minerality. There is that little bit of smokiness. So very characteristic of the appellation. Yeah, green apples. Oh, really nice. The smoke is really prominent. It's really nice with the green apple. It's kind of like it reminds me of a drink that I had at a restaurant once that was like a smoky green apple drink. It was actually a non-alcoholic pairing at a restaurant down in Melbourne, which was, amazing. But this is very reminiscent of that. There is I want to say, a very slight tropical note. But the smoke is just, definitely what I'm picking up the most. That and the green apple. Really nice. Oh, that is really nice. On the palate, the passion fruit definitely comes through. It's funny because on the nose, I was kind of getting, not sure if it's quite like a marzipan sort of smell. But on the palate, that passion fruit really comes through. The smoke is not so much there on the palate, which is quite interesting. It's definitely on the nose. The green apples are definitely on the nose. I still want to say there's just a very slight sort of nuttiness to it, just on the nose. Or like a slight, like candid sort of note. There's something else in there. I want to say some like a floral note, like a white blossom or something. Oh, there's just, on the palate, there's a little bit of spice. It's got that acidity, that freshness. The passion fruit is so much more pronounced on the palate. So much more pronounced. Oh, I love going back to the smoke though on the nose. You don't get so much of it on the palate, but on the nose, it's so nice. It's captivating. It makes me want to keep going back. That and the green apple, but then on the palate, the tropical fruits, the mineral drive, the flint that's coming through. It's just, oh, so nice. Cheers.